The two pieces that are being played in the gallery are called Connemara Landscape, Wind Study, which I made in 2022 earlier this year, and the other piece is called False Detection, which is a piece that has sort of been made over the process of the past few years and sort of finalised in 2021. Connemara Landscape is a piece that I made while I was on residency in a part of Ireland which is called Connemara. It's in the west of Ireland, and I suppose it's quite famous for being quite a picturesque and beautiful landscape, and there's a rich history there of painters and artists who would have visited that part of Ireland to paint it, particularly one artist who is referenced in the title of the work is Paul Henry, who was a painter from Belfast originally, but he was very famous for painting scenes in the west of Ireland. So I suppose when I went on the residency to interface in Connemara, I was sort of had Paul Henry's paintings in the back of my head and was trying to think about the idea of approaches to landscape and how that works within a painting context, and then also thinking about that in terms of how I engage with landscape and try to represent landscape in my own works, and what the sort of, I suppose, the differences and the similarities would be there. So with the work, I was really trying to think about how one tries to accurately represent a landscape, but then also interpret it in their own way as well, in the same way that a post-impressionist painter would, Henry would have been considered a post-impressionist. So whilst they would have been accurate depictions in the landscape, they also would have reflected himself in some kind of way as well. So I was trying to think about that a little bit. And through the process of engaging with recordings and stuff like that, Connemara is quite a hostile landscape. The environment can be quite difficult to work in just because the weather changes so much and it's quite erratic. You get all the wind coming in from the Atlantic, hitting that west coast, and yeah, there were a lot of challenges there with going out and recording and being very cold and sometimes maybe very miserable, trying to make these recordings and trying to figure out how to make a piece of work out of it. But it was through that I suppose tension with the landscape that actually something interesting was started to emerge, where I started to think about, instead of thinking of the environment as something that was like an opponent, I started to think about how I could collaborate with it. So using the context of the weather and its erraticness to try and create something. So I suppose I did a lot of different recordings using ambisonic microphones and contact microphones and all this different sort of stuff. And one of the things that I guess I was struggling with was the sound of the wind, which is something that I guess sometimes can be quite difficult in a sound recording context, because it's maybe something you actually try to get rid of in a recording or try to avoid in a recording because it can in some senses ruin it. But I started to lean into the idea of trying to figure out ways that I could actually record the sounds of the wind, and figuring out the ways that different microphones would respond to different types of materials and different things in the landscape. So I suppose the piece is made up of lots of different things to do with that, from just the sounds of trees, bending and rustling in the wind, using an ambisonic microphone, and recording the sound of those trees and different other parts of the landscape with contact microphones. So recording the vibrations that were coming off different objects caused by the wind. And there's also some really nice recordings, which are probably some of my most favourite recordings, really, which is there's a bog in Connemara called Derrygimna Bog, famous for being one of the first places that Marconi tried to transmit a message across the Atlantic to Newfoundland. But there were these metal poles sticking up out of the ground to sort of block off people from entering different parts of the site where different infrastructure was in place for Marconi's transmission station. And with the wind, the wind would pass through these metal poles and make these really beautiful whistling sounds that would create all these different types of melodies and stuff. So I spent a lot of time recording the sound of those poles and integrating them into the final work. And there also actually was, ironically enough, a wind sculpture in the bog that another artist made, which I also recorded as well. which also sounded quite beautiful. But like ironically, like the metal poles stood up quite well to the designed wind sculpture that was there. But yeah, so like I suppose I was starting to think about this idea of collaboration and translating landscape through sound recording and trying to represent it in some kind of way. So that's really where that work lies in terms of its rationale or motivation, I suppose. The second work is called False Detection, and that's a piece that I made in 2019. Started making it around 2019. So around the time when I was making that work, I started to get into like recording electromagnetic, record sound using electromagnetic pickups and stuff like that. So these sort of, transducers or whatever that can pick up the sounds of like electromagnetic radiation coming from like different electrical devices and stuff. And I suppose as part of like my practice and how I try to rationalize and think about things, I was reading a lot about like what electromagnetic fields are, and also like sort of stumbled down these rabbit holes of people sort of thinking about the health implications of electromagnetic fields. And how they might like affect your body in different types of ways, and I suppose there's like a lot of like spurious sort of things there, and it's not really conclusive whether those things they do have those effects or not. But if people feel like they do, I think that's quite valid to some extent. But one of the other things I guess that I started looking into was how electromagnetic radiation can affect other types of wildlife, like birds or insects or some fish as well. I think can be sensitive to these sort of fields, and I found that quite interesting. So as I was making these recordings, I then started to play around with the idea of like, I was thinking a lot about those types of things, and I suppose I came across the work of another sound artist called David Dunn, who did a piece called Mimus Polyglottos, I think is the name of it, from the 1970s, where he took a sine tone generator and started playing it in a forest to mimir birds, and then the mimir birds started to mimic back the sound of the sine tone generator, and they would like mimic the like little patterns he was making. And I found that type of like interaction between two species like quite interesting as like a concept. And then I came across this app called BirdNet, which is developed by Cornell University, I think, and it's basically like an app that's it's sort of like Shazam for birds, so like you can, if you hear a bird playing or singing a song, you can take out the app and hit the record button, and then the BirdNet will tell you what kind of bird is singing. So I thought it would be interesting to like, with the sort of idea of like David Dunn's methodology in my head, I decided it would be interesting to like just start playing these electromagnetic recordings that made to the BirdNet app, just to see what it would say. And I suppose most of the time it's like it's like the algorithm that it's using, the machine learning thing it's using is pretty smart, and it would tell you that like that's not a bird that it's hearing. Sometimes it would get tricked, but most of the time not. So then I decided, well, how can I trick this thing? So I started just manipulating the recordings I made, chopping them up a little bit, gating them, maybe repitching them slightly, different things like that. And just did that iteratively, like made a small change, then I played it back to the BirdNet app, then like seeing what the BirdNet app would say, and it'd be like, no, that's still not a bird I'm hearing, and would to incrementally make these changes until I tricked the app into thinking it was a bird of some kind, and then I would like sort of lock that off, and then once I'd made enough of these like sort of fake electromagnetic bird sounds, I started to make like the sound work out of it. So, and I suppose in another way, I was also like I've always really admired the work of Alvin Lucier, particularly like I'm sitting in a room, and I suppose like in a way, the work is sort of, in terms of process, is similar to Lucier's work in the sense that I'm sort of playing these sounds into the algorithm, and then based on the algorithm's feedback, then doing something else again to change it. So. Yeah, I suppose I've always been using field recordings in some kind of way. I suppose I started off as a musician, or interested in music, and sort of realized that like really I wasn't that interested in making music, but I was really interested in like recording techniques and the studio and that process of like editing recordings and using recordings in different types of ways, which and that relationship with music evolved into like getting into more and more into like experimental forms of music, which led me down that path of like field recording based practices and stuff like that. So I guess I was really just listening to this type of stuff and really interested in using it in my own kind of way, But yeah, like I suppose it's always been there, I've always been interested in making recordings of environments and different types of stuff like that, I suppose in terms of upcoming projects, I'm currently doing a research residency with an organisation in Limerick called Ormston House, and during that residency I've been following these conservationists that are trying to bring back a specific type of bird to Ireland called the corncrake, and doing research into how they're going about doing that, and just learning about the history of the bird and the habitats that it's living in and used to thriving in, and how sort of different like human practices, like agricultural practices, have affected that bird's habitat and led its to decline. So that's something that's going on at the moment, ongoing, and I'm hoping to make some work out of that in the future. In terms of other projects that are coming up, I'm currently also working on a new public sound artwork that will be for the Derry City Walls in Ireland. That's going to take the form of a mobile phone app. It'll be like a geo-located sound walk that people can download to their phones, and sort of as their GPS location changes around the walls, they'll experience this emerging soundscape. That work's sort of focusing on ideas of the future and dreaming, in particular in relation to like the weather and how our relationship with the weather is going to change over the next while, or how it's existed historically, how it exists today, and how it will maybe change in the future, particularly in relation to how we're sort of going into like I suppose this new age of like carbon neutrality and renewable sources of energy, and where like we're going to be really dependent on the weather in a certain type of way, in a way that we haven't really been before. Just trying to tease that out and explore it in different types of ways. So the work's going to be exploring that. It's still sort of ongoing, and it's all sort of research at the moment, but that's sort of where things are at with that, But yeah, those are the two main projects, and then there's another project which may be happening, which will be a public sound artwork for the Lagan Weir in Belfast. But yeah, that's all in the future. May or may not happen yet.